So we want to bring you some more analysis on this case in Illinois so far. Dr. Larry Barton is joining us now. He's a threat consultant, a professor of public safety at the University of Central Florida, and he teaches at the FBI Academy. Thank you so much for joining us. So we are learning a lot more about the suspect in this case. We learned that part of the way that he was able to get away is that he dressed up as a woman as he made his way through the crowd. He just blended in with his victims, essentially. What does that tell you?
Well, first, about 73% of perpetrators of mass violence actually are very calculated. They prepare, they spend time, whether it's looking at the opportunity site, whether it's thinking about who the victims may be. So what it says to me in terms of dressing in women's clothing is that this was a very calculated, smart person. You know, you can be mentally ill and still be a person who is cognitive, who is smart, and who has pre-planned. And so what it really says to me is that this was not in any way something that was just on a whim, if you will. This was very pre-planned and quite conniving.
And the police also say the suspect left his gun behind after the shooting. He had to know that it was registered. I mean, he's the one who purchased it. Why would he do something like that?
Well, because again, he's smart. Devious for sure, and a criminal for sure. But the suspect, by leaving his weapon, was able to also divert time because the police then go and immediately seize that weapon and start to register it. Remember that this individual, the suspect, had purchased 4 weapons recently, and in 2019 had attempted suicide and had attempted to murder his family. And yet, even after that, was granted the license to purchase these weapons. It's a stunning example of a failure of a system in which people who have mental illness and or a grievance and or just behavioral problems are still able. Can you imagine this? He had basically a modified AR-15. Even with that kind of background, was able to access those weapons legally.
And then ultimately, though, he did not go very far. They found him in Lake Forest, Illinois, which is just a few miles from where the shooting happened. Yeah, I thought for sure, especially as we sort of were getting closer to sundown, that he would be long gone and then would go even further once, you know, the dark of night would sort of hide his movements. Why do you suppose he didn't get very far?
Well, we're going to find out. I think the police will do a phenomenal job of obviously interviewing him. There were rumors at the time that he had driven as far as Madison, Wisconsin, but that is absolutely not confirmed at this time. But, you know, a person who is fearful that they will be captured, he obviously was trying to elude police, otherwise he wouldn't have left. If he wanted suicide by cop, that was probably just seconds away. So I think one of the reasons he probably stayed locally was he expected to be taken by police. It was just a matter of time.
The deputy police chief said there was no indication at the time the shooting was motivated by religion, but Highland Park is a fairly large Jewish population. Do you think it's possible that the choice to target Highland Park's parade was random?
It's possible. I've been working with a number of people who are Jewish who live in Highland Park. What's interesting about that question, of course, is that he could have gone to a temple. He could have gone to other places where you are more likely to target a specific group, whether it's of any, you know, religion or ethnic group, whatever. So right now, that does not appear to be the catalyst for this, but rather just an outrage and an anger. But remember, this is one of the basics, one of the essentials of basically criminology. You know, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. His past behavior was one of violence, of anger, not just about his rap music. That really is not very relevant. The fact that he had attempted suicide and attempted to kill his family is actually much more of a predictor of future behavioral problems.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Doctor. My sort of last question was going to ask you, if you were participating in this investigation, right, who would you be zeroing in on, and what are the questions that you would be asking to get a fuller understanding as to the type of threat that he was, that clearly, you know, people in his family said that they didn't seem to notice?
That's right. Well, you know, it's really interesting. People often say, well, Larry, isn't it true that somebody who's a loner or somebody who has rap music or somebody who posts something on the web? Well, the reality is a lot of people do a lot of knucklehead things in a variety of areas. Those are not necessarily predictors of violence. But when someone has 16 knives, this guy had 16 knives that back in 2019, when police went and interviewed him, they found a dagger, they found a sword. They found incredible information from him. And I'm hoping that one of the lessons that comes out of this for all of us is I'd like more accountability. I'd like to know who passed that background check, who actually authorized him to be able to buy 4 weapons recently, knowing that he had a violent past. We have to start having more accountability in this country for the people who basically authorize you and I to go. And why does a civilian need an automatic weapon? There is no, and this is not, we're not here to have that discussion, but it's very, very important, isn't it? If you lost your son, your daughter, your mom or dad, or any family or loved one, it's very critical that we start to find out what are these background checks, how are they conducted, who approves them, and start holding people accountable for it.
Oh, I think those are really good questions to ask. I mean, we know that when those knives were taken away from him, at the time he did not have a gun, and then in a very short period of time, he collected 4 of them. So is there no one asking, you know,
Right.
when's the last time you picked up a gun? No one's keeping track of any of this? And I think that's
exactly
that would it's sort of what angers a lot of people is in fact that the systems that are in place actually worked as they were intended, you know, and so the way so they're not working is basically the argument.
I often wonder, Doctor, if we still had the assault weapons ban that President Clinton signed into law that Republicans ultimately let lapse, if this young man would have been able to purchase these weapons.
And do the level of damage. Maybe he would have had a violent outbreak or outburst, but there's only so much you can do with a knife, you know?
I think it's very interesting what you just said about the Clinton ban, because it's absolutely true that if that ban was in place, the likelihood, now again, this is not absolutely guaranteed, but the likelihood that he would have been able to access this weapon is extremely low. And these lives could have been saved, and an entire community would not be traumatized as it is now. And candidly, working with some of the children that I'm doing right now, for generations to come, people will still be traumatized by this horrific individual.
Yeah.
Doctor, I know we have to wrap this up, but you just reminded me, you just heard our correspondent Adriana Diaz talking about that little boy whose parents were killed, 2 years old. The image of that child, his clothes stained with blood, it brought tears to my eyes. And I just wonder, and we were talking about it earlier on our earlier show, will he remember? If he remembers, what kind of trauma will that be? If he doesn't remember, what kind of trauma is that, knowing that your parents died in front of your eyes?
Totally.
What would be your opinion on that?
Thank you. First, just remember, whether it's a victim of war or child sexual abuse, children as young as 4 and 5 years old remember with great acuity, with remarkable memory, the actual details of a moment of trauma in their life, even in their 80s and 90s. We know that from generations of research. So your question is spot on.
Wow.
All right, Dr. Larry Barton, thank you, sir, for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you.